Trust, it's the very bedrock of every relationship, especially in marriage. But what happens when the one person you trust more than anyone else, the one who vows to be loyal and faithful, turns out to be the one breaking those promises? This is the story of Pastor Richard Barnes, a respected leader, a man of faith, and a man who betrayed the very vows he preached about. Richard had always been the one people turned to, the voice of reason in the chaos, the steady hand guiding his congregation through every storm of life. He was not just a pastor. He was a counselor, a mentor, a figure everyone could rely on. But behind closed doors, Richard was hiding a secret so devastating that it would be exposed in the most shocking way possible. In front of his entire congregation, on a Sunday morning, while delivering a sermon he'd meticulously prepared for weeks, his entire world came crashing down. Lisa Barnes, his wife, had been by his side for over a decade. She was more than just the pastor's wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word. She supported his ministry, his ambitions, and together, they created an image of the perfect family. But as she sat there in the front row of that church, expecting another peaceful Sunday service, little did she know, her life was about to unravel before her eyes. This was the moment that would define everything. The moment that would expose a betrayal that would tear apart a marriage, a family, and a church. Because while Lisa sat there, thinking her marriage was secure, Richard was leading a double life, and the woman he was sharing it with, Clara Mitchell, a woman who had been there the whole time, standing beside Lisa every Sunday. The wife of one of Richard's closest church friends, who smiled at Lisa, recited scripture, all the while keeping a secret that would destroy everything. Before we get into the chilling details of this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Insider for more real-life cases that will leave you speechless. Now, let's rewind for a moment and set the scene. Pastor Richard Barnes was a man of power and influence in his community. People sought his guidance when they were at their lowest, and when marriages faltered, when faith was shaken, Richard was the one who stood as a beacon of hope. He wasn't just the man behind the pulpit. He was the very foundation of the church. And in the front row, every Sunday, sat his wife, Lisa. Lisa Barnes wasn't just supportive. She was the embodiment of grace. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, organizing events, comforting the brokenhearted, and standing beside Richard through every sermon, every crisis, and every sleepless night. Her life, their life together, was the image of the perfect ministry. But no one knew that behind this perfect picture, things weren't as they seemed. While Richard was preaching about faithfulness, while he was guiding couples through their struggles, he was hiding a secret of his own, a secret so dangerous, it threatened to ruin everything. Clara Mitchell wasn't just any woman. She was married to one of Richard's own church members. She was a familiar face in the congregation, someone who had smiled at Lisa every Sunday, who had joined in the hymns, and who had stood beside her in worship. Yet, she was carrying on a secret relationship with Richard. It started small. A stolen glance, a brief conversation after service, then a late-night phone call that should have never happened. From there, it escalated, and before long, there was no turning back. But Clara wasn't the only secret in Richard's life. There was another woman, someone from his past, someone he had loved long before the church, long before Lisa. Her name was Sarah Clark. She had once been his first love, the woman he had imagined spending his life with. Before the ministry, before Lisa, before everything, Richard and Sarah had shared dreams of a future together. But when Richard answered the call to become a pastor, he walked away from Sarah, leaving her behind. For 20 years, Sarah was nothing more than a memory, until she wasn't. One day, out of nowhere, Sarah returned to Richard's life, and in an instant, he was that young man again, the one who had once dreamed of something more than church services. He found himself torn between his past and his present, between the life he had chosen and the love he had left behind. As Richard juggled these two women, Clara and Sarah, Lisa started to notice something was wrong. The woman who had stood by his side through everything was no longer the same. She began missing church services. The woman who had once been his constant support was becoming distant, distracted, and unapproachable. She would work late, come home late, and when Richard asked about it, she would brush it off with excuses. Her job at the hospital was demanding. She was just tired. It was a busy season. But Richard wasn't convinced. Then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Richard decided to surprise Lisa at work. He thought maybe they could reconnect, have a quiet lunch together. But when he arrived at the hospital, her office was empty. A nurse told him she had been sent to headquarters for a meeting, but something didn't sit right with him. As he walked toward the exit, he overheard two nurses gossiping. Their words hit him like a punch to the gut. They were talking about Lisa, about how she had been meeting with another man. Richard froze. He was filled with rage, disbelief, and confusion. Was Lisa really cheating on him? Was this the betrayal he had feared? But before he could confront her, he pulled away, his thoughts racing. He would need proof. The next few days were filled with doubt and suspicion. Richard began tracking Lisa's movements, paying attention to every detail of her routine. If she was a few minutes late, he would question it. If she seemed tired, he would wonder if it was because of another man. He checked her phone when she wasn't looking. There were no hidden messages, no deleted texts. But still, Richard refused to believe her. In his mind, she was hiding something. But what Richard didn't know was that he was spiraling down a dangerous path himself. He had his own secrets to hide. Clara, his mistress, was always waiting for him. The woman he wasn't supposed to want. The woman he couldn't seem to walk away from. It was wrong, but in his mind, he justified it. After all, if Lisa was cheating on him, then he had every right to do the same. One evening, as they sat at dinner, Lisa confronted him. "What's going on with you?" she asked, her voice strained. Richard's temper flared. "Where were you last night?" he demanded. Lisa answered, "I was at the hospital." But Richard wasn't convinced. "No, you weren't," he said, his voice sharp. The tension in the room was palpable. The next day, he called the hospital again, and this time, he learned that Lisa wasn't scheduled to work that night. That was the breaking point. He had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. But Lisa wasn't the only one hiding something. As Richard continued his obsession with Lisa's supposed affair, he confided in his closest friends. But instead of telling them the truth, he twisted the story. He made himself the victim. Lisa was hiding something. She was cheating on him. And there was one person who was more than happy to listen: Deacon Henry Thomas. Henry had been waiting for an opportunity like this, and now Richard was giving it to him. Henry didn't tell Richard to be careful, didn't caution him to trust his wife. Instead, he fed into Richard's paranoia, validating his suspicions. Then Henry took things further. He created a fake video. A video that showed Lisa meeting with another man. The video was carefully edited and manipulated, and once it was out there, it spread like wildfire. People started talking. Richard had finally gotten the proof he thought he needed. But everything changed when Richard played that video in front of the congregation. Sunday morning arrived, and the church was filled with people, all expecting another ordinary service. But Richard had other plans. He had decided that the truth would come out. He stood behind the pulpit, his voice steady as he began his sermon. But as he spoke, something changed. His tone grew heavier, more intense. "Some of you have been living in deceit," Richard said, his voice filling the sanctuary. "Some of you have broken your vows. Some of you have betrayed the people who trust you the most." The congregation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lisa's heart raced as she realized something was wrong. Then, Richard did something he had never done before. He looked directly at Lisa. "There is something the church needs to know," he said, his voice loud and firm. And then, in front of everyone, he made the accusation. "Lisa, you betrayed me. And worst of all, you betrayed this congregation." The room fell silent. Lisa's chest tightened. Her lips parted in shock. But Richard wasn't finished. He turned to the screen behind him and pressed play. The video began to play, showing Lisa meeting with another man. Gasps echoed through the room. But then, the truth came out. A church member stood up and declared the video was fake. She had seen the original, and it wasn't Lisa. It was someone else. The church erupted in shock. An ex-private investigator, who had been watching Richard, stood up and confirmed what everyone had feared. Richard had been cheating all along. The videos that were shown to the church were nothing more than a manipulation of the truth. Clara, his mistress, had been the real betrayer. Lisa had been the faithful one all along. The silence in the church was deafening. People who had once revered Richard Barnes were now looking at him with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. The atmosphere had shifted from confusion to cold, hard reality. The congregation, who had trusted this man with their lives, their faith, and their families, now realized that they had been standing behind a man who had betrayed not just his vows, but the very values he had preached to them for so many years. As the fake video played on the big screen, some people turned away, unable to look at the image that had been presented as proof. They had seen Richard as a beacon of truth, but now he was just another man with dark secrets, a man who had been hiding his true nature behind the pulpit. Lisa sat frozen, her body cold, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her chest. Her heart was heavy with disbelief. How could this be happening? For a brief moment, she wanted to shout out, to deny everything. She wanted to scream at Richard that none of it was true, that she was not the woman in the video. But her voice caught her throat. She could feel the eyes of the entire congregation on her, their gazes heavy with judgment. She had never imagined that the day would come when she would be accused of something so vile, something so far from who she was in the very place she had devoted her life to. And yet, despite the shame, Lisa still knew one thing to be true. She had not betrayed Richard. She had not been the one to break their vows. The video flickered off, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Lisa, feeling the sting of every pair of eyes on her, finally stood up. She felt a strange calm come over her. The time for hiding in the shadows was over. It was time to take control of her narrative, to fight back against the lies that had been spread about her. "Malcolm," Lisa said, her voice trembling with emotion, but firm. "This is a lie. I have never—" She paused, gathering her strength before she continued. "I have never betrayed you. This is not true." The murmur of voices swirled through the congregation. Some were still unsure, but others began to speak up in her defense. They whispered words of disbelief, some shaking their heads, others trying to process what had just unfolded. As Lisa confronted Richard, there was an unexpected interruption. The church doors creaked open, and an unfamiliar figure stepped into the room. It was an older man, dressed in a modest suit, but his presence filled the room with anticipation. He wasn't a familiar face to many in the congregation, but his air of authority was undeniable. He was a former private investigator, a man who had been quietly observing Richard for weeks. He had seen the cracks in the facade, had noticed the moments that didn't add up, and now, with everything laid bare before the congregation, he couldn't stay silent any longer. "I have something I need to share," the investigator said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The man you've trusted, the man who stood at this pulpit, has been living a double life. And I have proof." Richard's eyes widened in shock. The investigator didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone, holding it up for all to see. "Just last month, I saw Pastor Richard Barnes with Clara Mitchell," the investigator continued. "I saw them together at a hotel parking lot, getting into the same car. I thought I was mistaken at first, but after seeing them again, I knew what I had witnessed." The congregation was stunned. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes glued to the screen. The investigator's words were like a punch to the gut, leaving everyone gasping for air. There was more. The investigator had seen them again, this time at a restaurant, talking, laughing, their faces too close, too intimate. Richard's face drained of color as the truth came crashing down on him. He had been exposed, not just for his betrayal of Lisa, but for everything he had done to cover up his lies. As the video footage continued to play on the screen, it became clear that there was no escaping the truth. But Richard didn't immediately back down. He stood there, his hands gripping the pulpit, as if holding on to the very thing that had once given him power. The room was filled with tension, with anger, with disbelief. This man, who had preached loyalty and faithfulness, had shattered the trust of everyone who had followed him. Then, the congregation's shock turned to whispers. One by one, people stood up, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some of them looked at Lisa, offering her silent support. Others turned away from Richard, unable to look at him any longer. The church had become a battlefield, one that Richard had created. "Enough," said one of the elders, his voice steady, yet filled with finality. The room grew silent again as everyone turned to face him. "Pastor Richard, you've left us no choice. You're to step down immediately." Gasps filled the room. Some were surprised, others relieved. Lisa's chest tightened as the weight of what had just happened settled over her. She had never expected this, never imagined she would see the day when Richard would lose everything. And yet, as the elder's words echoed in the room, she knew it was the only way forward. Richard didn't argue. He didn't fight back. His shoulders slumped as the reality of his downfall hit him. He had lost everything. His church, his marriage, his reputation. It was all gone in an instant. Lisa didn't wait around to witness the aftermath. She stood tall, her heart pounding with the weight of everything that had happened. She walked toward the doors, her steps steady and purposeful. She was done. Done with the lies. Done with the betrayal. Done with a man who had humiliated her in front of an entire church. She wasn't going to stay in a place where her name had been tarnished, where the truth had been twisted to fit someone else's agenda. As she walked out of the church, the doors swinging closed behind her, the sound of her heels clicking against the floor seemed to echo in the silence that followed. The life she had once known, the life she had built with Richard, was over. But she knew that she was walking away from the man who had broken her heart, from the man who had broken their vows. As Lisa stepped out into the sunlight, she felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. There was no more hiding, no more pretending. The truth had been exposed, and now she could move forward, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. But the story didn't end there. The consequences of that Sunday morning would follow Clara Mitchell like a shadow. Her life, once filled with secrets and lies, was now on display for the world to see. Her husband refused to take her back. The church no longer supported her. She had nowhere left to turn. The whispers didn't stop. In fact, they grew louder. The weight of the shame and the scandal crushed Clara. She lost her sense of self, lost everything she had built. And one day, the news spread like wildfire. Clara had taken her own life. The guilt, the shame, the weight of her choices had become too much to bear. Some say she couldn't live with the humiliation. Others believe she had no place left to turn, no one left to help her. Whatever the reason, her tragic end became a footnote in the story of a betrayal that tore apart a family, a church, and a community. For Richard Barnes, the man who had once stood tall behind the pulpit, life would never be the same. The church that had once served as his kingdom, the very place he had built his reputation, had become the place where his downfall began. He had lost everything: his marriage, his ministry, his reputation. All the years of hard work, dedication, and influence had been reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. The very foundation of his life, his identity, had crumbled, leaving him a shadow of the man he used to be. The lies he had woven to cover up his infidelity, to protect himself from the truth, had brought him to this point. He had manipulated, deceived, and betrayed everyone who trusted him. And now, with nothing left but the ruins of his life, Richard was forced to face the truth he had spent so long running from. He couldn't escape it anymore. The walls had closed in, and there was nowhere left to hide. His carefully constructed world had shattered, and all that remained were the pieces of his broken past. Lisa had walked away. She had found her strength in the face of betrayal, in the face of humiliation. She had stood up for herself when Richard had refused to see the truth. And now it was his turn. His turn to face the consequences of his actions. His turn to confront the damage he had caused, not just to Lisa, but to the entire church and community that had once looked up to him. No longer a pastor, no longer a man of influence, Richard was left to question everything he thought he knew about himself. Who was he without the title, without the respect, without the church? What did his life mean now? Without the pulpit, without the title of pastor, who was he really? A man who had failed those he swore to protect? A man who had betrayed his vows, not once, but twice. Richard was consumed by guilt. But was that guilt the true reason he had accused Lisa? Was it the fear that if he pointed the finger at her, the attention would be diverted from his own sins? Or was it the deep, searing paranoia that his own betrayal would finally be exposed, that the truth about his double life would come crashing down around him? Was that why he had tried to destroy her reputation in front of everyone? Because he couldn't bear the thought of being the one revealed as the real villain? His mind spun in circles, a constant battle between guilt and denial. He asked himself if he could ever redeem himself. Could he ever rebuild the trust he had broken so completely? Could he ever regain the respect of the people he had betrayed? And if not, was this the end of his story? Had he ruined everything for good? Was there any way to crawl out from the wreckage of his life and start again? Or had he already gone too far? With every thought, with every fleeting hope, the reality set in. Redemption wasn't going to come easily, if at all. He was no longer the man he used to be. The past would never fade, and the scars he had left on those around him would never truly heal. All he had now were the fragments of his life, his reputation reduced to ashes. As Richard stood alone, grappling with the ruins of his decisions, the weight of everything he had lost felt unbearable. He had destroyed the one thing that truly mattered, his marriage, his family. And in the process, he had lost the trust of a congregation that once called him their spiritual leader. What was left? What could he do now that everything he had worked for had been stolen from him by his own actions? The pain of it all became too much to bear. Richard sank into a deep sense of despair, the reality of his life setting in with brutal clarity. His days of standing before the congregation with confidence and power were over. Now, he was left to face himself, his failures, his lies, and the wreckage he had caused. The church was gone, and Lisa had walked away. The question lingered in the air, unanswered and suffocating. Could he ever redeem himself? Or was this truly the end of his story? If you're left wondering what happens next, or want to know more real-life cases like this, make sure to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Insider for more real-life cases that will leave you speechless.